A mountain man married the obese teen no one dared to touch. Then he froze when she began to sing a song his dead wife once wrote. Snow whips across a dusty frontier town as the crowd laughs, mocking the girl sold like livestock. One man steps forward, silent, broad-shouldered, haunted, and offers a single silver coin. He marries her right there in front of everyone and rides away into the storm. But deep in the mountains, when his new wife saves his life through the night, he hears a tune that stops his heart cold. How does this stranger know his late wife's hymn, the song no one else ever heard? As blizzards rise and railroad men close in to steal his land, one secret links mercy, death, and the power of a forgotten song. Now faith and love must battle shame, greed, and ghosts in the high country. Who is this girl God sent to his door, and can she thaw the mountain that has frozen his heart for years? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The bitter wind cut through Calder's Bluff like a knife, whipping dust and dead leaves across the muddy street where wagons lined up for the livestock sale. Eliana Mayfield huddled beneath her thin shawl, her cheeks burning with shame as her father swayed on his feet, waving a near-empty whiskey bottle. "Who'll take her?" James Mayfield bellowed, his words slurring. "Strong back, knows her letters, worth a wagon of supplies, I reckon." Eliana's heart hammered against her ribs as cruel laughter rippled through the crowd. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to disappear into her faded calico dress. The November wind carried whispers that cut deeper than the cold. "Ain't worth half a wagon, that one. Too much mouth to feed. Who'd want such a burden?" Tears pricked at her eyes, but Eliana refused to let them fall. She fixed her gaze on the distant mountains, just as her mother had taught her to do in times of trouble. "The Lord is my shepherd," she whispered, her mother's favorite psalm bringing small comfort. The crowd parted as Owen Hale's tall figure appeared, his weathered face impossible to read. The mountain man rarely came to town, and when he did, it was for supplies and nothing more. Today he carried an empty pack, likely seeking salt and nails for the winter ahead. Eliana had seen him before, always at a distance. Stories about him circulated through town like autumn leaves, how he'd lost his wife in the mission fire years ago, how he lived alone in the high country, how he spoke more to his horses than to people. His presence commanded a quiet respect, even from the crueler townsfolk. Owen's dark eyes took in the scene, narrowing as James Mayfield continued his drunken auction. The mountain man's jaw tightened, and something flickered across his face. Not pity, but something harder. Anger. "$1 silver," Owen's voice cut through the jeers, deep and steady as a mountain stream. The laughter died. Even James Mayfield stumbled into silence. "What did you say?" Mayfield squinted at Owen, swaying slightly. $1 silver," Owen repeated, reaching into his coat pocket. The coin caught the weak November sun as he held it up. "For your daughter's hand in marriage." Fresh titters rose from the crowd, but Owen's steady gaze silenced them. He stepped forward, boots heavy in the mud, and placed himself between Eliana and the onlookers. Though he didn't look at her directly, his presence formed a shield against their stares. "Preacher," Owen called out, and Reverend Matthews stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, his Bible clutched to his chest. "We need your services. Now." The preacher glanced between Owen and James Mayfield, who was staring at the silver dollar as if trying to remember what it was. "Mr. Hale, surely this isn't—" "It is." Owen's tone left no room for argument. He pressed the coin into Mayfield's trembling hand. "Your daughter deserves better than this shame. I aim to give her that." Eliana's head spun. She could hardly breathe, caught between terror and an inexplicable sense of safety. Owen Hale was a stranger, yes, but he stood like a mountain between her and her father's cruelty, between her and the town's mockery. "Very well," Reverend Matthews said softly, opening his Bible. The crowd pressed closer, their entertainment transformed into something else entirely. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Owen finally turned to face Eliana. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw not disgust or resignation, but a steady kindness that made her throat tight. "Miss Mayfield," he said quietly, "I offer you my name and my protection. Will you accept?" She could only nod, her voice lost somewhere between fear and desperate hope. The ceremony was brief, the words ancient and binding. Owen's responses were clear and firm, while Eliana's came out as whispers. As Reverend Matthews pronounced them man and wife, the first snowflakes began to fall, dusting Eliana's dark hair with white. Owen shrugged off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. The wool was warm from his body, and it smelled of pine smoke and leather. Without a word, he lifted her onto his horse as if she weighed nothing at all, his hands respectful and sure. The crowd had fallen silent, perhaps finally understanding the gravity of what they'd witnessed. Owen mounted behind Eliana, one arm steady around her waist. She sat stiffly, afraid to lean back against him despite the cold wind that cut through even his coat. "Hold fast," he murmured, and turned the horse northward, toward the mountains that rose like shadows against the darkening sky. As they rode away from Calder's Bluff, Eliana heard the whispers fade into the gathering dusk. The snow fell harder now, erasing their tracks almost as soon as they were made. She stole a glance at her father, but he had already turned away, stumbling toward the saloon with his silver dollar clutched tight. The horse's steady gait carried them farther from the only life Eliana had known. Though fear still fluttered in her chest, something else grew alongside it, a fragile hope as delicate as the snowflakes that melted on her cheeks. Owen Hale might be a stranger, but he had offered her mercy when no one else would. Perhaps that was enough to build upon. The mountains loomed closer as dusk deepened into true night. Owen guided the horse with confidence, seemingly unbothered by the growing darkness or the thickening snow. His arm remained steady around her waist, neither pulling her closer nor pushing her away, simply ensuring she wouldn't fall. Eliana watched her breath cloud in the cold air, remembering her mother's words from long ago. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, child. Sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places." As the lights of Calder's Bluff disappeared behind them, Eliana offered up a silent prayer. Not for herself, but for the quiet man who had turned public shame into a sacred vow. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white silence as they rode toward whatever future awaited them in the shadow of the mountains. The frozen trail wound through stands of bare aspens, their white trunks stark against the gathering storm. Eliana clung to Owen's broad back, her fingers stiff despite the warmth of his coat. Each careful step of the horse sent jolts through her tensed muscles, but she dared not complain. The man who had saved her from public shame might still change his mind. The snow fell thicker now, dusting Owen's shoulders and catching in his dark hair. He guided the horse with sure hands, though the path grew treacherous with ice. Eliana watched his steady movements, trying to read something, anything, in the set of his shoulders, or the way he held himself. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the horse's labored breathing and the soft crunch of hooves in fresh snow. Eliana's throat ached with unasked questions, but fear kept them locked inside. What kind of man would marry a stranger out of mercy? What awaited her in his mountain home? Finally, Owen spoke, his voice gentle as summer rain. Cabin's about 8 miles ahead, Miss Mayfield. We'll make it by nightfall if this weather holds." He paused, then added, "Though you're welcome to call me Owen, being as we're married now." "Eliana?" she whispered, surprising herself. "My name is Eliana." He nodded, and she felt some of the tension ease from his back. "Eliana, then. There's bread and dried apple in my saddlebag if you're hungry." The kindness in his voice made her eyes sting. She shook her head, though he couldn't see it. "I'm fine. Thank you kindly." They came to a creek crossing where ice rimmed the stones like delicate lace. Owen dismounted to lead the horse, his boots breaking through the thin shore ice. Halfway across, the horse's hoof slipped on a submerged rock. Owen caught the reins, steadying the startled animal, but the effort seemed to drain him. He staggered, catching himself against the horse's shoulder. "Sir, Owen?" Eliana leaned forward, worry overcoming her shyness. "Are you all right?" "Just tired," he said, but his voice had grown hoarse. "Been riding since dawn to reach town." He remounted with less grace than before, and Eliana felt a tremor run through his frame. The storm intensified, thick flakes cutting visibility to mere yards. Owen pulled up at a small structure barely visible through the whiteness, a line shack, its windows dark and door hanging crooked. "We'll wait out the worst here," he said, helping her down. His hands were careful, treating her like something precious rather than the burden she knew herself to be. No sense risking the horse in this. The shack's interior was musty but dry. Owen checked the chimney while Eliana gathered scattered kindling, her movements small and uncertain. When he nodded approval, she set about building a fire, grateful for this one useful skill her mother had taught her. The flames caught slowly, filling the single room with wavering light. Owen brought in supplies from his saddlebags, then settled himself against the wall farthest from where Eliana huddled in his coat. He sat upright, arms crossed, clearly intending to sleep that way. "Sir?" Eliana ventured, confused by his distance. "There's room enough." "You take your rest, Eliana," he said firmly but not unkindly. "You're safe here. I gave my word." She stared at him, understanding slowly dawning. This stranger who had married her to save her from shame now kept his distance to protect her virtue. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them away, settling into his coat and letting exhaustion claim her. Dawn broke clear and cold, the storm spent. Eliana woke to find Owen already outside, tending the horse. The morning sun struck the snow-covered peaks, turning them to gold and rose quartz. The beauty stole her breath, making her forget for a moment all that had brought her here. They mounted up again, Owen lifting her as carefully as before. But as they rode, Eliana noticed his breathing growing more labored. He coughed occasionally, trying to muffle the sound in his sleeve. The cold seemed to have settled in his chest during their night in the shack. The sun wheeled overhead, shadows lengthening as they climbed higher into the mountains. Owen's breathing grew more ragged with each mile, though he said nothing of his discomfort. Eliana found herself supporting more of his weight as his strength ebbed. Finally, as the day's last light painted the snow in shades of amber, they crested a ridge thick with pines. Below them sat a small cabin, neat and well-maintained, with smoke rising from its stone chimney. "Home," Owen managed, the word rough in his throat. He slid from the saddle, then reached up to help Eliana down. His hands were steady even now, ensuring her feet found solid ground. But as she turned to thank him, Owen's eyes rolled back. Without a sound, he pitched forward into the snow, face first and utterly still. "Owen!" Eliana dropped to her knees beside him, heart pounding. She rolled him over, noting with terror how hot his skin felt despite the freezing air. His breathing came in shallow gasps, his face flushed with fever. The man who had saved her now needed saving himself. Eliana looked between Owen's unconscious form and the cabin that was to be her new home, knowing the next moments would test everything her mother had taught her about courage and care. The snow beneath Owen's face began to melt from his fever heat, and Eliana knew she could not afford to hesitate any longer. Eliana's hands trembled as she gripped Owen's shoulders, straining to turn him over in the deepening snow. His skin burned with fever despite the biting cold, and his breathing came in ragged gasps. The cabin stood just yards away, but Owen's muscled frame might as well have been a mountain itself. "Please, Lord," she whispered, "give me strength." Her own body, which had brought her such shame in town, now became her ally. Planting her feet wide, she hooked her arms under Owen's and began to drag him backward through the snow. Each step was a battle. Her boots slipped on the icy ground, and Owen's dead weight threatened to pull her down. But inch by inch, she made progress. The horse watched with steam rising from its flanks, too exhausted to help. Finally, Eliana's back hit the cabin door. She fumbled with the latch, nearly crying with relief when it opened. The cabin's interior was cold but dry, with a stone fireplace and simple furnishings. A bed stood in one corner, its quilt neat and tucked. Getting Owen inside took the last of her strength. She managed to drag him onto a bearskin rug near the hearth, then collapsed beside him, gasping. But she couldn't rest, not with his lips turning that terrible shade of blue. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "Never warm a frozen person too quick, child. That's how you lose them. Slow and steady brings life back proper." Eliana forced herself to move methodically. First, she gathered kindling from a box by the hearth and coaxed the banked coals into flames. Then she searched the cabin's neat shelves until she found what she needed: smooth river stones, meant for just such emergencies. She placed the stones near the growing fire to heat, then turned her attention to Owen. His clothes were soaked with melted snow. With trembling fingers, she removed his boots and outer layers, averting her eyes as much as possible to preserve his dignity. The quilts from the bed came next, layered over him carefully. "I'm sorry," she whispered as she worked. "I know you meant to keep your distance, but I can't let you die of pride." Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the pine boughs and rattling the shutters. Eliana moved the heated stones close to Owen's body, but not touching, just near enough to share their warmth. His breathing remained shallow, but some of the blue tinge left his lips. As full dark settled, Eliana kept her vigil. She heated more stones, checked his temperature, and prayed. When the silence grew too heavy, she began to hum, soft and low at first, then with more confidence. It was the song her mother had taught her, one that had comforted them both through hard times. The Mountain Mercy Song, her mother had called it. The melody was simple but haunting, speaking of grace found in the highest places where snow and stars met. Eliana didn't know all the words, but the tune itself was a prayer. Hour after hour passed. The fire burned low and was built up again. Snow piled against the windows. Eliana's voice grew hoarse, but she kept humming, letting the familiar notes steady her hands as she tended Owen. Near dawn, when the cabin's interior had taken on that peculiar gray light that preceded sunrise, Owen stirred. His eyes opened slowly, focusing on nothing at first. Then his gaze sharpened, and he turned his head toward the sound of Eliana's song. The change that came over his face struck her like a physical blow. All color drained from his cheeks, and his eyes went wide with something between wonder and fear. His whole body began to tremble, and not from the cold. "Where?" he croaked, voice cracking. "Where did you learn that song?" Eliana's humming faltered. "My mama taught it to me," she said softly. "She said it came from a woman in the mountains who died saving a man's soul." Owen's breathing quickened. He tried to sit up but fell back, weak from the fever. "Your mother?" he whispered. "What was her name?" "Sarah," Eliana replied. "She was a mission nurse before she married my father. She learned it from—" "Rebecca," Owen cut in, the name seeming to tear itself from his throat. "Rebecca Hale. My wife." The firelight flickered between them, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Eliana sat very still, feeling as though the ground had shifted beneath her. The song that had comforted her through years of her father's cruelty had come from this man's dead wife. "She worked at the mission," Owen continued, his voice distant. "Taught the hymn to other nurses, said it was meant for healing broken spirits." His eyes closed tight against some memory. "She died there, in the fire. I wasn't—" He broke off, turning his face away. Eliana saw a tear track down his weathered cheek. "Mama said the woman who taught her was full of light," Eliana whispered, "that she believed mercy was stronger than any darkness." Owen's shoulder shook once, a silent sob. The fire popped and hissed, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind began to die down, leaving an enormous silence in its wake. Eliana reached out hesitantly, then drew back, unsure if touch would be welcome. Instead, she began to hum again, very softly. The melody wound through the cabin like a living thing, bridging the space between them. Owen lay still, tears falling freely, now. But his breathing steadied, falling into rhythm with the song. Neither spoke again, as the gray light strengthened into dawn, both shaken by the unseen hand that had brought them together through a dead woman's hymn. The fire burned low one final time as morning crept into the cabin. Eliana added another log, watching the flames catch. When she looked back at Owen, his eyes were closed, his sleep now natural rather than fevered. But his fingers were moving slightly, as if conducting a melody only he could hear. The first rays of dawn spilled over the snow-covered ridge, painting the cabin's interior in soft golden light. Owen stirred on his makeshift bed by the hearth, his eyes opening slowly as awareness returned. Eliana sat nearby in a wooden chair, her hands folded in her lap, watching him with a mixture of concern and relief. "I'm sorry," Owen said, his voice rough from sleep. "Didn't mean to frighten you like that." He tried to push himself up, grimacing at the effort. "Please, don't strain yourself," Eliana said, moving to help him. "The fever only broke a few hours ago." Owen settled back against the bearskin rug, looking at her with new eyes. Gone was the trembling girl from the auction block. In her place sat someone who had kept death at bay through the longest night of his life. "You know how to brew coffee?" he asked, gesturing toward a tin pot on a shelf. "Yes, sir." Eliana stood, grateful for something practical to do. Her hands shook slightly as she measured the grounds, but pride steadied them. She had saved this man's life. Surely she could manage his morning coffee. The familiar ritual of brewing helped calm her nerves. Soon, the cabin filled with the rich aroma of coffee. She poured 2 cups, handed one to Owen, then perched uncertainly on the edge of her chair. They sipped in awkward silence, 2 strangers bound by hasty vows and an unexpected hymn. Owen cleared his throat. "Reckon you should know the lay of the land," he said finally. "Cabin ain't much, but it's solid." He pointed out the features of their single room. The stone fireplace, the rough-hewn table and chairs, shelves stocked with supplies. A ladder led to a small loft above, where a pallet lay ready for sleeping. "Outside, there's a corral for the horse," he continued, "and a stream about 50 yards back. Good water, never freezes completely." He paused, studying his coffee. "It's not what you're used to, I expect." Eliana thought of her father's failing ranch, the endless work and harsh words. "I want to help," she said firmly. "I can clean and cook. It's the least I can do after your kindness." Owen nodded slowly. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "But if you want to make yourself at home—" He gestured toward the cabin. Eliana spent the morning straightening the simple space while Owen dozed by the fire, still recovering. As she worked, she found a leather-bound Bible tucked away on a high shelf. Beside it lay a carefully folded shawl, delicate despite its age. Her heart caught. These must have belonged to Rebecca. When Owen woke again, she brought them to him. "I found these while cleaning," she said softly. "I thought you might want them." Owen's face hardened, pain flashing across his features. But when he spoke, his voice was gentle. "Keep them safe," he said. "They should belong to a woman again." Eliana held the items close, touched by his trust. The day passed quietly as Owen regained his strength. She cooked a simple supper of beans and cornbread, setting his portion close to his chair. As evening settled in, Owen took up a piece of wood and began carving by firelight. His knife moved steadily, creating smooth curves from rough pine. Eliana watched his hands work, wondering at the story behind each scar and callus. The familiar melody of the Mountain Mercy song rose in her throat. She hummed softly, almost unconsciously, as she darned a sock by candlelight. Owen's knife paused. "Tell me about your mother," he said, still looking at the wood in his hands. "You said she was a nurse?" Eliana's fingers stilled on her mending. "Yes. She worked at a mission far south, in the Red Rock country. That's where she learned your wife's song." She swallowed hard. "She died when I was 13. Fever took her quick, before anyone could help." Owen stared into the fire, his carving forgotten. "Rebecca died in those same mountains," he said quietly. "The mission caught fire during a storm. She was trying to save the medical supplies." His voice trailed off. "Mama spoke of her often," Eliana said. "Said she was the kindest person she'd ever known. Always singing, always helping others find their way back to hope." Owen's hands tightened on the carved wood. "She believed in mercy above all else, said it was God's greatest gift, that we could choose to be kind even when the world wasn't." He set the carving aside, unfinished. "I lost that belief when I lost her." "But you showed mercy to me," Eliana said softly. "At the auction block." Owen looked at her then, really looked at her. "Maybe some part of her is still teaching me," he said. "Through that song of hers, through you being here." The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, an owl called into the gathering night. Neither spoke for a long while, both lost in memories of the women who had shaped their lives. One a mentor, one a wife, both connected by a simple hymn of mercy. Eliana ran her fingers over Rebecca's shawl, feeling the delicate weave. She could almost imagine the woman who had worn it, singing of hope in the mountain heights. Somehow, through paths neither could have foreseen, that song had brought Eliana to this cabin, to this quiet man with his hidden wounds. Owen picked up his carving again, the soft scrape of his knife keeping time with Eliana's humming. The familiar melody filled the cabin like a prayer, bridging the space between past and present, between loss and the possibility of healing. As night deepened around the cabin, the snow began falling again, gentle this time, as if the storm had spent its fury. Eliana added another log to the fire, watching the flames leap up. When she looked back at Owen, she saw tears glinting in his eyes, but his hands remained steady on his work. They sat together in the firelight, the song weaving around them like an invisible thread. Through the cabin's window, stars peeked between snow clouds, their light touching the fresh-fallen snow. Inside, two souls brought together by grief and mercy continued their quiet vigil, each wondering what tomorrow might bring. The days stretched like shadows across fresh snow as Eliana and Owen settled into an uneasy rhythm. Each morning brought new tasks, new lessons in survival that Eliana tackled with quiet determination. The mountain air bit at her cheeks as she learned to swing the heavy axe, her arms trembling with effort. "Keep your stance wide," Owen instructed, demonstrating the proper form. "Let the weight of the axe do the work." He watched from the cabin's porch, still favoring his frost-nipped legs. Eliana nodded, readjusting her grip. The axe head struck true this time, splitting the log clean down the middle. A small victory, but her chest swelled with pride. "Well done," Owen said simply. His praise, though sparse, felt earned. The routine of gathering snow for water became almost meditative. Eliana would drag the wooden sledge behind her, filling buckets with clean snow to melt over the fire. The task reminded her of helping her mother wash linens at the mission, transforming something pure into something useful. In the cabin's small kitchen area, Eliana discovered her own kind of courage. The venison Owen had stored required careful preparation. Her first attempt at stew had been too salty, but Owen ate it without complaint. By the fourth day, she had mastered the balance of herbs and timing. The rich aroma filled their small home, making it feel more lived in. Owen's recovery progressed slowly. Though the worst of the frostbite had healed, a noticeable limp remained when he walked. Eliana noticed how he gritted his teeth against the pain, especially in the cold mornings. She began keeping a pot of willow bark tea ready, remembering her mother's remedies. They moved around each other carefully, like wary dance partners learning unfamiliar steps. Words were few, but actions spoke volumes. Owen would stack extra wood by the door before Eliana woke. She would mend his clothes without being asked, her neat stitches closing tears and reinforcing worn spots. One evening, as the sun painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of amber, Eliana sat cross-legged by the fire, working on Owen's coat. The heavy fabric was worn at the elbows, threatening to split. Her needle flashed in the firelight as she reinforced the seams. A whispered voice caught her attention. Owen sat in his chair by the window, head bowed, hands clasped, tight. His words, barely audible, carried the weight of long-held pain. "Lord, I know I ain't worthy," he murmured, "but please, forgive me for not being there in time, for letting the fire take her, for losing faith when I needed it most." Eliana's hands stilled on her mending. Without thinking, she folded her own hands and joined his prayer, her soft voice harmonizing with his like a gentle echo. "Lord, grant peace to those who carry heavy burdens. Help us find mercy in the midst of pain. Guide us toward healing, even when the path seems dark." Owen's head lifted, surprise flickering across his weathered features. Their eyes met across the room. Something shifted in that moment, a wall crumbling, a bridge beginning to form. He nodded once, gratitude replacing guardedness in his gaze. The wolves began their nightly chorus then, their haunting songs rolling across the ridge like winter thunder. Eliana shivered, not from cold, but from the wildness in those voices. "They're getting bolder," Owen said, rising from his chair. He retrieved his rifle from its place above the door, checking the mechanism with practiced hands. "Time you learned to handle this." The next morning dawned clear and crisp. Owen led Eliana to a small clearing behind the cabin, setting up targets against a snow-covered log. The rifle felt foreign in her hands, too long, too heavy, too dangerous. "Remember," Owen said, adjusting her grip. "It's got kick. Brace it firm against your shoulder." His hands were gentle as he positioned her arms. "Breathe out slow when you squeeze the trigger." Eliana's first shot went wide, the recoil nearly knocking her backward. Her second clipped the edge of a target. By the sixth try, she managed to hit near the center, though her shoulder ached fiercely. "Good," Owen said. "You're a quick study." He took the rifle, showing her how to clean it properly. "I need to know you can protect yourself if—" He trailed off, but Eliana understood. If something happened to him. If she was alone again. "Thank you," he said suddenly, his voice rough with emotion. "For what you did that night, when the cold took me." His eyes met hers, direct and sincere. "I reckon I wouldn't be here if you hadn't known what to do." The praise warmed her more than any fire could. Without thinking, Eliana smiled. A real smile, the first since coming to the mountain. It transformed her face, bringing light to her eyes and color to her cheeks. Owen stared for a moment, something softening in his expression. The hard lines around his mouth eased, and for just a heartbeat, he looked younger, unburdened. He quickly looked away, busying himself with the rifle, but Eliana had seen it, that crack in his armor, that glimpse of the man he might have been before grief carved its valleys into his soul. They walked back to the cabin together, their boots crunching in perfect rhythm through the snow. The morning sun caught ice crystals in the air, making them dance like diamond dust. Around them, the mountain stood sentinel, its ancient peaks watching as two lonely hearts began, slowly, to thaw. Inside, Eliana hung their snow-dampened coats by the fire. Owen limped to his chair, wincing slightly. Without a word, she poured him a cup of willow bark tea, setting it at his elbow. He nodded his thanks, and they settled into their quiet routine. Him carving, her mending, the fire crackling between them like a conversation neither was ready to have. The wolves sang again that evening, their voices closer now. But somehow their songs seemed less threatening, more like a reminder that even in the wildest places, no creature was meant to be entirely alone. February brought a subtle shift to the mountain air. The iron grip of winter loosened just enough for thin rivulets of snowmelt to trace dark paths down icicles hanging from the cabin's eaves. Owen stood in the pale morning light, testing the firmness of the trail with his boot. "The path to town should be passable now," he said, adjusting the empty grain sack over his shoulder. "I'll be back before sunset." Eliana nodded from the doorway, wrapping her shawl tighter against the lingering chill. "We're low on salt," she reminded him softly. "And maybe some thread, if you can spare the coins." Owen checked his horse's cinch, his movements precise and practiced. "I reckon I can manage that." He paused, glancing back at her. "You'll be all right here alone?" "Yes," she said, squaring her shoulders. "I know how to work the rifle now, and there's plenty to keep me busy." He mounted with only a slight wince from his healing legs, gathering the reins. "Bar the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone else." With a gentle kick, he urged his horse forward, becoming smaller and smaller against the vast white landscape until he disappeared around the bend. Eliana stood watching long after he'd gone, feeling the silence of the mountain press in around her. It was the first time she'd been truly alone since that day at the auction block. The thought sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. Inside, she set about her usual tasks with extra vigor, determined to prove herself useful in Owen's absence. She swept the rough wooden floors, beat the dust from the bedding, and scrubbed the iron cookware until it gleamed. The physical work helped keep her mind from wandering to dark places, to her father's cruel words, to the jeering crowd, to the uncertainty still threading through her days. Near midday, while reaching high to dust the ceiling beams, her cloth caught on something. A small leather-bound book tumbled down, landing with a soft thud on the bed. Eliana picked it up carefully, running her fingers over the worn cover. The pages were filled with delicate handwriting, the ink faded but still legible. Her heart stuttered as she read the first line. "My dearest Thomas, I pray these words find their way to you someday, though I fear I may never have the courage to share them." This wasn't Owen's writing. The gentle curves of the letters, the careful way each thought was expressed, this belonged to his wife. Eliana knew she should close it, return it to its hiding place. But her eyes were drawn to the next passage like moths to flame. The mission work grows more demanding each day, so many souls in need of care, of comfort. But I cannot regret coming here, even as the winter storms rage. God's purpose is clear in every face we help, every life we touch. Eliana sank onto the bed, transfixed. Pages turned beneath her trembling fingers as the story unfolded. A woman of deep faith, serving at a mountain mission, writing letters she never sent to a brother far away. The entries grew more urgent as they progressed. "There is a man who comes to our services now, Thomas. His eyes hold such pain, such anger at God. I see him watching from the back pew, never speaking, never staying. But something tells me he is searching for peace, even if he doesn't know it yet. I pray each night that the Lord will help me reach him, help him find his way back to faith." Eliana's breath caught. Could she be writing about Owen? The dates matched what little she knew of his past. She read on, tears beginning to blur her vision. "The winter has been harsh. Our supplies run low and the snow shows no sign of letting up. But I cannot abandon these people who depend on us. Owen, that is the man's name, brought us firewood today. He still won't meet my eyes, but I saw him slip extra blankets onto the children's cots. There is goodness in him, buried beneath his grief. I only pray I live long enough to help him see it." The last entry was written in a shaking hand, the ink splotched as if by fallen tears. "Thomas, I fear this may be my final letter. The fire is spreading too quickly. The children are safely out, thank God, but the roof is failing. I can hear Owen shouting my name from outside, but the smoke is too thick to find my way. If these words survive, tell him it wasn't his fault. Tell him God's mercy is greater than any sin he imagines. Tell him to live, to love again, to find the peace he deserves." Eliana didn't hear the door open, didn't notice the lengthening shadows or the sound of boots on the threshold. It wasn't until Owen's shadow fell across the page that she realized he had returned. The change that came over his face was terrible to witness. Recognition, shock, and fury warred in his features as his eyes fell on the journal in her hands. The supplies he carried crashed to the floor. "Where did you get that?" His voice was deadly quiet. Eliana rose, the journal clutched to her chest. I was cleaning, and it fell. I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have—" "No," he cut her off, closing the distance between them in 2 long strides. "You shouldn't have." He snatched the journal from her hands, his fingers white-knuckled around the leather binding. "My past is none of your concern. You had no right!" His shout filled the small cabin, making Eliana stumble backward. "I didn't mean to pry," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Please, I only wanted—" "To what?" Owen's voice cracked like ice breaking. "To dig up memories best left buried? To judge me for not saving her?" He turned away, his broad shoulders rigid with tension. Get out of my sight." Eliana fled to the kitchen area, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the table edge. Behind her, she heard Owen's heavy breathing, the creak of his chair as he sank into it. The journal lay in his lap, but he didn't open it. Silence filled the cabin like smoke, choking and heavy. Through her tears, Eliana forced herself to move. She kneaded dough with trembling fingers, letting the familiar motions calm her racing heart. When the bread was baked, she placed a warm slice on a plate and set it near his chair. Beneath it, she tucked a carefully written note. "I only wished to understand." She climbed to her sleeping loft without a word, listening to the pop and hiss of the fire below. Hours passed. The moon rose, painting silver squares on the wooden floor through the window. Just before sleep claimed her, she heard Owen's voice, so soft it might have been the wind. So did I. The words hung in the darkness like a prayer, a confession, a bridge across the chasm of grief that separated them. Eliana lay awake long after, remembering the last words of a woman who had seen goodness in a broken man, words of mercy, of hope, of love stronger than death itself. In the room below, Owen sat motionless by the dying fire, the journal still unopened in his lap, his fingers tracing the worn edges as if trying to touch the hand that had written those final words of grace. The February thaw came suddenly, turning the pristine snow into patches of brown slush. Icicles dripped steadily from the cabin's eaves, and the air held a hint of coming spring. Eliana stood at the window, watching drops of water catch the morning light. The tension from the journal incident still lingered, though Owen had grown less distant in recent days. The sound of approaching horses broke the morning quiet. Eliana's heart quickened. Visitors were rare this high in the mountains. Through the foggy glass, she made out 2 men on sturdy bay horses, dressed in city clothes that seemed out of place against the rugged landscape. Owen emerged from the barn, axe in hand, his stance wary as the strangers dismounted. Eliana moved closer to the door, straining to hear their conversation. "Morning," the taller of the 2 men called out, removing his bowler hat. "Name's Harrison. This here's Mr. Peterson. We represent the Western Railroad Company." He pulled out a leather folder, all businesslike. "We're here about the water rights to Spring Creek." Owen's shoulders stiffened. "That spring's on my property." "Actually," Peterson stepped forward, producing a document. "We have here a deed signed by one Elias Mayfield, granting full rights to the spring and surrounding acreage to the railroad company. Signed and notarized 3 months ago." The name hit Eliana like a physical blow. She pushed open the door, stepping onto the porch. Owen turned at the sound, his face darkening as he looked between her and the surveyors. "Mayfield?" Owen's voice was dangerously quiet. "You mean her father?" Harrison nodded, consulting his papers. "Yes, sold the rights for a decent sum too, though word is he didn't live long enough to spend it." He glanced at Eliana with something like pity. "Sorry for your loss, ma'am." Eliana gripped the porch railing, her legs suddenly weak. "I didn't know," she whispered. "Papa never told me about any sale." "The deed's legal," Peterson continued, seemingly oblivious to the growing tension. "We'll need access to survey the spring and surrounding area. Company plans to run the rail line through here by summer's end." He paused, finally noting Owen's thunderous expression. "Of course, you'll need to vacate the property within the week. Company policy." "Vacate?" Owen's hand tightened on the axe handle. "This is my home. I've worked this land for 8 years." Harrison shrugged apologetically. "The deed gives us rights to 100 yards on either side of the spring. Your cabin falls within that boundary. Nothing personal, just progress." Owen turned to Eliana, his eyes hard as flint. "Did you know about this?" "No!" tears sprang to her eyes. "I swear, Owen, I had no idea Papa would—" "Like you had no idea about reading private things that weren't yours?" His words cut like ice. "Seems there's a lot you Mayfields keep hidden." "Please." She stepped toward him, but he backed away. "I would never. Save it." Owen's voice was raw. "Your father's signature is about to cost me everything I've built here. And you expect me to believe you knew nothing?" The surveyors shifted uncomfortably. "We'll leave the official notice here," Harrison said, placing a folded paper on a fence post. 7 days should be sufficient to clear out. Good day to you both." They mounted quickly and rode away, leaving silence in their wake. Owen stood rigid, staring at the notice as if it might burst into flames. Without warning, he stalked to the woodpile, seized the axe, and began chopping with violent force. Each swing seemed to carry years of pent-up rage. Eliana watched him, her heart breaking. When she tried to speak, he wouldn't even look at her. The rhythmic thud of axe against wood continued until the sun began to set, each blow driving home the weight of her father's final betrayal. As darkness crept across the yard, Eliana sank to her knees in the melting snow. The cold seeped through her skirts, but she barely noticed. Her prayers came in desperate whispers. "Lord, please, show me what to do. How can I make this right?" She touched the frozen ground beneath her, thinking of Owen's years of labor, the life he'd built here. All threatened now, because of her father's greed. The cabin door creaked. Owen trudged inside without a word, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. Through the window she watched him sink into his chair by the cold hearth, head in his hands. Eliana rose slowly, her skirts heavy with melted snow. Inside, she moved quietly through the familiar space, gathering her few belongings. The Bible and shawl that had belonged to Owen's wife, she left carefully folded on the table. Her mother's recipe book, a spare dress, some dried herbs, these she wrapped in a small bundle. The sounds of her packing must have reached Owen, but he didn't stir from his chair. The silence between them stretched like a bottomless chasm. Finally, Eliana placed a folded note beside the Bible. Her tears smudged the ink as she wrote, "I'm sorry for all the trouble my family has brought you. You showed me kindness when no one else would, and I've only brought you pain in return. I'll pray you find a way to keep your home. God be with you, Owen." She paused at the door, looking back at his bowed head. The urge to run to him, to beg his forgiveness, to promise they could fight this together. It nearly overwhelmed her. But the memory of his words, the betrayal in his eyes, held her back. He would never trust her now. Eliana stepped out into the gathering night. The temperature was dropping again, ice beginning to form, where water had pooled during the day. She clutched her small bundle closer and started down the mountain path, leaving behind the only place she'd felt truly safe since her mother died. Behind her, the cabin's warm light spilled from the window, a beacon she forced herself not to look back at. Each step took her further from Owen, from the brief dream of belonging she'd dared to nurture. Her father's final act of selfishness had destroyed whatever fragile trust had grown between them. The stars emerged one by one overhead as Eliana made her way down the snowy trail, her heart as heavy as her feet. Somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf howled, a sound of loneliness that echoed her own despair. Gray shadows stretched across the snow as Eliana crept from behind the barn, her boots crunching softly in the fresh powder. Owen's mare nickered softly at her approach, and she pressed a gentle finger to her lips. The beast knew her now after weeks of feeding and grooming. "Quiet now, girl," she whispered, her trembling hands working the leather straps in the dim pre-dawn light. The familiar motions Owen had taught her seemed to mock her now. Another kindness she'd repaid with trouble. Her mother's silver locket hung heavy around her neck, its weight a constant reminder of the past. She'd kept Owen's wife's shawl, too, unable to leave it behind despite her guilt. Something about it felt important, though she couldn't say why. The eastern sky barely hinted at morning when she led the horse from the barn. Fresh snow had begun falling, thick flakes that promised another storm. Eliana glanced back at the cabin's dark windows, her heart aching. No light showed within. Owen must still be sleeping off his exhaustion from yesterday's wood-chopping fury. "Lord, watch over him," she prayed softly as she mounted. "Help him save his home somehow." She turned the horse south, toward the mountains her mother had spoken of so often in her stories. Somewhere in those peaks lay the abandoned mission where her mother had nursed the sick and dying. It seemed fitting to seek shelter there now, when she had nowhere else to go. The snow fell harder as morning crept across the land. Eliana hunched deeper into her coat, letting the horse pick its way along the trail. Her mother's tales guided her, past the lightning-struck pine, through the narrow canyon where wildflowers would bloom come spring, across the creek that sang even in winter. By midday, the storm had grown fierce. Wind howled through the peaks, driving needles of ice against her face. She could barely see the path ahead, trusting the horse's sure steps to keep them from the edge. Back at the cabin, Owen woke late, his muscles protesting yesterday's rage. The house felt wrong, too quiet, too still. Something important was missing. "Eliana?" he called, rising stiffly. No answer came. The cabin's emptiness struck him then, her shawl gone from its peg, no coffee warming on the stove, no quiet humming as she worked. Panic surged through him as he spotted her note on the table. "No," he breathed, reading her words. "No, no, no." He burst outside, scanning the fresh snow. Horse tracks led south from the barn, his best mare, the one he'd taught Eliana to ride. Already the falling snow was filling them in. "Fool woman," he muttered, though whether he meant Eliana or himself, he wasn't sure. The memory of his harsh words yesterday burned in his throat. Within minutes he had his second-best horse saddled, provisions hastily shoved into saddlebags. The storm was building, and Eliana was out there alone, because he'd let his anger drive her away. Just like he'd driven everyone away since Sarah died. "Hold on," he whispered into the wind as he mounted. "Please, Lord, let me find her in time." The tracks led south, toward the high country where the old mission lay in ruins. Owen's heart clenched. He hadn't been near that place since the fire that took Sarah. But if that's where Eliana had gone... Hour after hour, Eliana pressed on through the storm. The cold had long since numbed her feet and hands. Even the horse moved slower now, struggling against the wind. Through the swirling snow, she finally glimpsed weathered stone walls rising before her. The mission stood like a ghost of itself, half buried in decades of snow. Windows gaped empty to the sky, and the bell tower listed dangerously to one side. But it was shelter from the storm. Eliana dismounted stiffly, leading the horse into what remained of the stable. Her legs nearly gave out as she removed the saddle with frozen fingers. "We'll rest here, girl," she told the mare, "just until the storm passes." The mission's heavy wooden doors still hung on their hinges, creaking as she pushed them open. Inside, snow had drifted through broken windows, but part of the roof still held. Eliana's steps echoed in the empty sanctuary as she made her way toward what had once been the altar. A half-rotted chest caught her eye, its lid warped open by years of moisture. Inside, beneath molded cloth and mouse-chewed paper, she found a leather-bound ledger. Its pages were stiff with water damage, but much was still legible. Eliana sank to her knees, holding the book close to what light filtered through the windows. Names and dates filled the pages, records of those who'd passed through the mission. But it was a note in the margin that made her breath catch. Sarah Hale has composed a hymn of comfort for our dying. The Mountain Mercy Song, she calls it. Such peace it brings to those who suffer here. Sarah Hale, Owen's wife, the woman who'd written the very hymn Eliana's mother had taught her, the song that had helped her save Owen's life that first night. "Mama," she whispered, touching the locket at her throat. "You learned it here, didn't you? From her." She turned more pages with trembling fingers. There, her mother's name appeared among the mission nurses, right after Sarah's final entry. The truth clicked into place like a key in a lock. Her mother had carried Sarah's song away from this place, passing it on to Eliana before she died. The cold was deeper now, seeping into her bones. Eliana tried to stand, but found she couldn't feel her legs. The ledger slipped from her numb fingers as she slumped against the altar rail. "The valleys shall rise to the mountains," she whispered, her voice barely a thread in the vast silence, "and mercy shall flow like a stream." The final verse of Sarah's hymn fell from her blue lips as darkness gathered at the edges of her vision. Outside, the storm howled on, drowning out the sound of hoofbeats approaching through the snow. Moonlight pierced the storm clouds in weak silver shafts as Owen urged his horse through deepening drifts. The wind howled between the peaks, driving ice needles against his face, but he barely felt the sting. His whole being focused on the tracks ahead, tracks that grew fainter with each passing hour. "Eliana." His voice was swallowed by the storm's fury. The ruined mission had to be close now, though darkness made landmarks hard to read. He'd avoided these heights for years, letting grief keep him away. Now fear drove him back, fear of losing another woman to these merciless mountains. His horse stumbled, and Owen's heart lurched. The poor beast had been pushing hard for hours. "Come on, boy," he muttered, patting the gelding's straining neck. Just a little further. Through the swirling snow, dark shapes finally emerged, broken walls rising like ancient bones against the night sky. Thatoon, mission. Owen's throat tightened at the sight. Memories crashed over him, Sarah tending the sick, her gentle voice lifting in song, then later, smoke and screams and helplessness. "Eliana," he called again, louder now. No answer came from the shadowed ruins. He dismounted stiffly, his boots crunching in the knee-deep snow. Leading his horse, he made his way toward the stables first. Relief flooded him at the sight of his mare inside, though the animal seemed distressed, stamping and whickering in the darkness. "Easy, girl," he soothed, quickly checking her condition. She was cold, but unhurt. Eliana must have cared for her properly before what? Fear spurred him back into the storm. The mission's main doors hung open, creaking in the wind. Snow had drifted across the threshold like a funeral shroud. "Eliana!" His voice echoed in the vast emptiness. Moonlight filtered through broken windows, casting weird shadows across fallen beams and snow-covered pews. There, a darker shape slumped against the altar rail. Owen's heart stopped. "No," he breathed, stumbling forward. "Please, Lord, no." Eliana lay crumpled beneath the broken cross, her face pale as the snow around her. Her hands, blue with cold, still clutched a water-damaged book to her chest. Owen fell to his knees beside her, touching her cheek with trembling fingers. Cold. So cold. "Don't you do this," he growled, gathering her stiff form into his arms. "Don't you dare leave me too." He pressed his ear to her chest, holding his breath. There, the faintest flutter of a heartbeat. Still alive, but barely. Owen shrugged out of his heavy coat, wrapping it tightly around her. The book fell from her frozen fingers. Some kind of ledger. He tucked it quickly into his shirt. There'd be time to look at it later, if there was a later. Getting her onto his horse was a struggle, but desperation lent him strength. He mounted behind her, cradling her against his chest. Her head lolled lifelessly on his shoulder. "Hold on," he whispered, turning the horse toward home. "Just hold on." The storm seemed to fight their every step, as if the mountains themselves wanted to keep her. Owen hunched over Eliana's still form, trying to shield her from the worst of the wind. His voice cracked as he began to sing, soft and uncertain at first, then stronger. "The valleys shall rise to the mountains, and mercy shall flow like a stream." The hymn that had haunted him for years now became a prayer, a plea bargain with God. Each verse carried memories of Sarah, but also hope that somehow this time would be different. This time he wouldn't fail. "Take me instead," he begged between verses. "If you need a life tonight, take mine, but let her live." Hours blurred together as they pushed through the darkness. Owen sang until his voice gave out, then hummed, then whispered. Anything to keep the silence at bay, anything to keep Eliana's faint heartbeat going. Near dawn, the storm finally began to ease. Owen's cabin emerged from the gray light like a miracle. His hands shook so badly he could barely dismount without dropping her. Inside, he laid her gently before the fireplace. The embers still held some heat, and he quickly fed them fresh wood. Soon, flames danced across Eliana's too pale face as Owen worked frantically to save her. He removed her frozen boots and stockings, rubbing her feet between his hands. Her skin was like ice, but there was no blackness of frostbite. Not yet. Moving to her hands, he chafed them carefully, willing warmth back into her fingers. "Come back to me," he whispered, tears tracking unnoticed down his cheeks. "Please come back." Time crawled by as he worked. He wrapped her in every blanket he owned, heated rocks to place around her body, and prayed harder than he had in years. Slowly, so slowly, color began returning to her face. When her eyelids finally flickered, Owen thought he might collapse from relief. She stirred weakly, confusion clouding her features. "Why?" Her voice was barely a thread of sound. "Why did you come?" "Because I couldn't lose you too." His voice broke on the words. "You're free now," she whispered. "The land claim—" "Damn the land!" Owen burst out. "None of that matters. I thought, when I found you there, in the mission—" His shoulders began to shake. "Just like Sarah, I couldn't save her either." The confession he'd held back for years poured out of him then, raw and aching. "The fire started in the night. Sarah was trying to get the sick ones out. I was in town for supplies. By the time I got back—" He pressed his fists to his eyes. "I should have been there. Should have saved her. My fault. It was all my fault." Eliana's cold hand found his, gripping with surprising strength. "Owen," she said softly. "Look at me." He raised his tear-stained face to meet her gaze. "Your wife. She wrote the hymn that saved us both. The one my mother learned at the mission." Her other hand touched the ledger that had fallen from his shirt. She was giving hope to the dying. And her song. Eliana's voice grew stronger. Her song lived on. "Through my mother, through me. Your wife saved my mother's faith when she was losing hope. Now I've returned it to you." Owen stared at her, seeing for the first time how God's mercy could flow like the hymn said, from Sarah to Eliana's mother to Eliana herself, and finally back to him. The weight of guilt he'd carried for so long began to crack and crumble. "I thought God had abandoned me," he whispered. "He sent me instead. Eliana answered simply. Owen bowed his head, tears falling freely now. But these were different tears. Cleansing, healing. Eliana's hand remained steady in his, as dawn's light filled the cabin, chasing away the last shadows of night. The mountain air held the first hints of spring thaw as Eliana sat propped up in Owen's wooden rocker, watching snowmelt drip from the cabin's eaves. Her strength returned slowly, like sap, rising in the pines after winter's grip loosened. Each day brought small victories, sitting up longer, walking to the table unaided, helping with simple chores. Owen hovered near, his usual stoic manner replaced by gentle attentiveness that surprised them both. He'd arranged the rocker just so, where sunlight through the window could warm her face. His rough hands, more accustomed to trapping and woodcraft, now carefully measured herbs for healing tea and tucked quilts around her shoulders. "You don't have to fuss so," Eliana told him one morning, though her heart warmed at his concern. "Reckon I do," he answered quietly, setting a steaming cup beside her. "Nearly lost you out there." The memory of that desperate night at the mission hung between them, but it no longer carried the sharp edge of pain. Instead, it had become a turning point, the moment their separate griefs had somehow merged and begun to heal. They talked more freely now, their conversations stretching long into the evening hours. Owen spoke of Sarah, not with the old, raw anguish, but with gentle remembrance. He told stories of their early days in the cabin, of her dedication to the sick and dying at the mission. "She always said God put us here for a purpose," he mused one night, stoking the fire. "Took me years to understand what she meant." Eliana nodded, thinking of her own mother's unwavering faith. "Sometimes his purpose finds us when we least expect it." By the 5th day, she could walk the length of the cabin without resting. Owen watched her progress with pride barely concealed behind his beard. When she suggested they try walking outside, he agreed, but insisted on supporting her arm. The afternoon sun had carved paths through the snow, leaving patches of damp earth exposed. They made their way carefully down to the spring, where clear water bubbled up from between rocks. Owen pointed to a flat stretch of ground nearby. "Always meant to put in a garden here," he said. "Good soil, protected from the worst winds. Sarah had plans for herbs and such, but—" His voice trailed off. Eliana squeezed his arm gently. "We could plant one together, come spring," she offered. "My mother taught me about medicinal herbs. Between the two of us, we might make something grow." Owen's eyes softened as he looked down at her. "Might at that." They stood there a while, listening to the spring's cheerful gurgle and watching mountain bluebirds flit between the pines. The air felt different somehow, full of possibility rather than regret. That evening, Owen brought out Sarah's old Bible, its pages marked with pressed flowers and notes in her careful hand. Together, they read passages she had underlined, finding comfort in the familiar words about renewal and hope. "I never thought I'd feel peace here again," Owen admitted. "After Sarah, after everything, I just existed. Didn't really live." "And now?" Eliana asked softly. He met her gaze steadily. "Now I'm starting to remember what it means to have faith. In God, in new beginnings." Dawn broke clear on the 7th morning. Eliana woke early, feeling stronger than she had in days. She was just setting water to boil for coffee when she heard it, the distant thunder of hoofbeats echoing up the canyon. Owen heard it too. He rose from the breakfast table, his face growing tight as he moved to the window. 3 riders approached through the morning mist, the familiar figure of Sheriff Houghton flanked by 2 men in city clothes. "Stay inside," Owen told her quietly, reaching for his coat. He stepped out onto the porch to meet them as they reined up in the yard. Eliana watched through the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. Sheriff Houghton looked uncomfortable, not meeting Owen's eyes as he dismounted. One of the other men, a sharp-featured fellow in an expensive coat, produced a paper from his saddlebag. "Mr. Hale," the man's voice carried clearly in the crisp air, "I represent the Western Railroad Land Company. This is a legal writ of seizure for this property." Owen's shoulders stiffened, but his voice remained level. "On what grounds?" "We hold a signed agreement from Elias Mayfield, dated 18 months ago, granting rights to all water sources in this section, including the spring that feeds your homestead." Eliana's legs went weak. Her father, even after abandoning her mother, even after drinking away their own ranch, had managed one final betrayal. "This land's been mine for 8 years, Owen said. "I have the proper claims filed." The railroad man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "The water rights supersede your claim, Mr. Hale. Without legal access to the spring, your homestead rights are void. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises." Eliana couldn't bear it any longer. She pushed open the door, ignoring Owen's warning look. "My father had no right to sell what wasn't his," she declared, her voice shaking but clear. "He'd never even seen this land." "Nevertheless, Mrs. Hale, his signature is legally binding." The man held out the writ. "The company's claim has been properly registered with the territorial office." Sheriff Houghton finally spoke up, his weathered face troubled. "I'm sorry, Owen. You know I got to uphold the law." Owen took the paper, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, only the sound of melting snow dripping from the eaves broke the tense silence. "I won't fight you with guns," he said at last. "That's not my way, but I mean to appeal this proper and peaceful like in town." The railroad man shrugged. "Appeal all you want. The law's on our side." He turned his horse, gesturing to his companion. 48 hours, Mr. Hale. Not a minute more." They rode away, hoofbeats fading into the canyon's shadows. Sheriff Houghton lingered, looking miserable. "Owen, if there was anything I could do—" "I know, Abel." Owen's voice was tired but firm. "You're doing your duty. Can't fault you for that." After the sheriff departed, Owen stood motionless on the porch, the writ crumpled in his fist. Eliana moved closer, placing her hand on his arm. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "This is all because of my father." "No." Owen turned to her, his eyes fierce with determination. "This isn't your fault. The railroad's been trying to grab every water source in the territory. They'd have found some other way if not this." "What will we do?" Owen smoothed out the paper, studying it carefully. "First we pray. Then we ride into town and fight this the right way, with truth and justice on our side." He looked down at her, his expression softening. "Together." Eliana nodded, drawing strength from his resolve. Whatever came next, they would face it as one, just as they had faced the storm, the past, and their own wounded hearts. The morning sun broke through the clouds, touching the melting snow with gold, as if to remind them that even the darkest winter eventually yields to spring. Gray clouds hung low over Calder's Bluff as Owen and Eliana rode down Main Street. The morning air carried the sharp bite of coming rain, and shopkeepers hurried to bring in their wares before the weather turned. Owen's stallion moved steadily forward, while Eliana's borrowed mare followed close behind. The whispers started as soon as they passed the general store. Women paused in their sweeping to stare. Men gathered in clusters, their voices dropping to harsh murmurs. Eliana felt her cheeks burn as she recognized faces from the auction block, the same people who had laughed at her father's cruel offer. "Pay them no mind," Owen said quietly, though she noticed how his shoulders had tensed. "We're here for justice. Nothing else. They dismounted in front of the courthouse, a weathered two-story building with peeling white paint. Owen helped her down, his hands gentle but firm. The leather satchel containing Sarah's mission ledger felt heavy against Eliana's hip. Inside, the courthouse smelled of dust and old paper. Their boots echoed on the wooden floor as they made their way to the main chamber. Several townspeople had already gathered, including Mrs. Temperance Gray, who offered Eliana an encouraging nod from her seat near the back. The railroad company's agent, Marcus Wheeler, stood near the judge's desk in his fine Eastern suit. His thin lips curved into a mocking smile as Owen and Eliana entered. Behind him sat two other men in expensive clothing, company lawyers by the look of them. Judge Harrison, a stern-faced man with iron-gray hair, called the hearing to order. The room gradually fell silent, though the whispers continued like dry leaves rustling in corners. Wheeler stepped forward, producing Elias Mayfield's deed with a flourish. "Your Honor, the matter is quite simple. We hold legal title to all water rights in the disputed territory, signed and witnessed 18 months ago." The judge adjusted his spectacles. "Proceed, Mr. Wheeler." Wheeler cleared his throat and began reading the document aloud, his voice dripping with false courtesy. But when he reached Elias Mayfield's name, his tone changed. "Signed by the same man who later tried to trade his own daughter." Wheeler's eyes fixed on Eliana with calculated cruelty, the girl no man wanted, until Mr. Hale here made his charitable purchase. A few snickers rippled through the crowd. Eliana felt herself shrinking, the old shame threatening to overwhelm her. But then she felt Owen's hand brush against hers, steady and warm. Owen stood slowly, his massive frame drawing every eye in the room. His jaw worked beneath his beard, and for a moment, Eliana saw fury flash in his eyes. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the railing before them. Then, something shifted in his expression. The anger drained away, replaced by a calm dignity that seemed to fill the entire chamber. He removed his hat, holding it respectfully before him. "Your Honor," he said evenly, his voice carrying to every corner, "I married Eliana Mayfield because God showed me what beauty means." The silence that followed was absolute. Even Wheeler's smirk faltered. Owen continued, his words measured and clear. "Not the kind folks measure with scales or dollars. The beauty of a soul that stays gentle despite cruelty, of hands that heal instead of harm, of faith that burns bright in the darkest night." He glanced at Eliana, his eyes soft with pride. "I didn't make a charitable purchase, sir. I received a blessing I surely didn't deserve." Eliana felt tears welling up, but she held her head high. In that moment, she understood what her mother had always said about dignity being a gift from God, not men. Reverend Thomas, who had been standing quietly near the courthouse doors, stepped forward. "Your Honor, if I may speak?" The judge nodded, and the Reverend approached the bench. "I performed Owen and Eliana's marriage ceremony. While some might have seen only a transaction that day, I witnessed a sacred covenant, and I believe there may be more to this case than a simple water rights dispute." He turned to Eliana. "Mrs. Hale, the ledger you found at the mission. May I see it?" With trembling fingers, Eliana withdrew Sarah's old ledger from her satchel. The leather binding was worn smooth with age, its pages water-stained but still legible. The Reverend handled it with careful respect, turning to specific entries he had marked earlier that morning. "Your Honor, this document contains the original mission charter from 1847. Within it, there's a specific clause regarding water rights in the territory." He adjusted his glasses and read aloud. "All springs and water sources within the mission's boundary shall be held in trust for the common good. never to be sold or transferred without the consent of both the mission board and the territorial governor. Wheeler stepped forward, his face flushing. That mission burned down years ago. Any such charter is void. Not so, Reverend Thomas replied calmly. The mission's legal incorporation was never dissolved. While the building may be gone, its founding charter remains binding under territorial law. The spring on Owen Hale's property lies within the original mission boundaries. Therefore, Elias Mayfield had no legal right to sell those water rights to your company. A murmur of excitement rippled through the crowd. Judge Harrison leaned forward, suddenly alert. Do you have documentation to support this claim? Yes, Your Honor. The Reverend opened the ledger to another page, where a carefully drawn map showed the mission's original boundaries. The spring in question is clearly marked here, along with a notation about its use for healing the sick. It was considered a sacred trust. Wheeler's lawyers huddled together, whispering urgently. The agent's face had gone from red to pale. Judge Harrison studied the documents carefully, referring to several law books on his desk. The room grew tense with anticipation as minutes ticked by on the courthouse clock. Finally, the judge looked up. The mission charter appears to be properly filed and witnessed. If these boundaries are accurate, then any sale of water rights within them would indeed be invalid without proper authorization. He fixed Wheeler with a stern gaze. Did your company obtain consent from either the mission board or the territorial governor before purchasing these rights? Wheeler tugged at his collar. We were unaware of any such requirement, Your Honor. Then I have no choice but to declare the deed null and void. The judge's gavel cracked sharply against wood. The water rights remain as originally established under the mission charter. Mr. Hale's homestead claim stands. A cheer went up from the crowd. Mrs. Gray hurried forward to embrace Eliana, while several men clapped Owen on the back. Wheeler and his lawyers gathered their papers and slipped out, their defeat written in every sharp movement. But Eliana barely noticed any of it. She was watching Owen, who stood with his head bowed, whispering what looked like a prayer of thanksgiving. When he raised his eyes to meet hers, she saw in them not triumph, but profound gratitude. For justice, for mercy, and for the mysterious ways God had led them both to this moment. Outside, the clouds had begun to break, allowing rays of sunlight to pierce through. As they prepared to mount their horses for the ride home, Reverend Thomas approached them one last time. The mission may be gone, he said softly, but its purpose lives on, in acts of mercy, in faithful hearts, in love that sees true beauty. He smiled at them both. You've reminded us all of that today. The townspeople watching from the courthouse steps were no longer whispering in mockery. Instead, they stood in respectful silence as Owen helped Eliana onto her horse. The couple rode out of Calder's Bluff side by side, their shadows merging in the strengthening light of afternoon. Reverend Thomas held the mission ledger high, its weathered pages catching the late afternoon light streaming through the courthouse windows. There's more here, Your Honor. The charter contains a specific provision about restoration of the lands. The judge motioned for him to continue. The crowd pressed closer, eager to hear. According to this document, the Reverend read carefully, the mission spring and all attached lands shall pass to whoever restores true worship through the Mountain Mercy hymn, as witnessed by the gathered faithful. He looked up, his eyes finding Eliana. This hymn was composed specifically for the mission's healing work. Its singing was considered a sacred act of mercy. A murmur rippled through the courthouse. Wheeler, who had been slouching toward the door, turned back with narrowed eyes. I move we settle this properly, Reverend Thomas announced. Sunday service. Let the whole town witness whether the spirit of the mission still lives. Judge Harrison nodded slowly. A fair proposal. Let it be done according to the charter's terms. Word spread quickly through Calder's Bluff. By Sunday morning, the little white church was packed full, despite the bitter cold. Townspeople stamped snow from their boots and huddled close on the hard wooden pews, their breath visible in the chilly air. Eliana sat in the front row, fingers twisting the worn hymnal in her lap. Her plain dress had been carefully pressed, though it did little to hide her full figure. She could feel the weight of every stare, hear the whispered comments behind raised hands. Owen slipped in just as the service began, taking a seat in the back row. He removed his hat, revealing hair still damp from his morning wash. His eyes never left Eliana, steady and encouraging. Reverend Thomas read from Scripture, his voice strong and clear. "But let all who take refuge in you rejoice. Let them ever sing for joy." He closed the Bible and looked out over the congregation. Today we gather to witness a restoration, not just of land, but of faith and community. He gestured for Eliana to come forward. Her legs trembled as she rose, but she forced herself to walk steadily to the front of the church. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet in the heavy silence. "Mrs. Hale," the Reverend said gently, "will you share the Mountain Mercy hymn with us?" Eliana closed her eyes, remembering her mother's voice singing her to sleep. The melody was written in her heart, though she'd never performed it for anyone but Owen. Taking a deep breath, she began to sing. The first notes came out soft and uncertain, barely reaching the front pews. But as the familiar words filled her mouth, strength flowed into her voice. "In valleys deep where shadows lie, where hope seems far and comfort nigh, a spring of mercy waters flow, to heal all hearts weighed down by woe." Her voice grew stronger with each line, rich and clear as morning light. The hymn's message of healing and hope soared to the rafters, filling every corner of the church. Several women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Through storm and night, through grief and pain, His mercy flows like gentle rain. No soul so lost, no heart so dry, but grace can lift our spirits high. Old Mr. Peterson, who hadn't set foot in church since his wife died, removed his hat and bowed his head. Mrs. Gray, who had shown Eliana kindness that first terrible day, smiled through her tears. As Eliana began the final verse, something remarkable happened. Other voices began joining in, first just a few, then more, until the entire congregation was singing. The harmony swelled, rich and full. "So come ye thirsty, come and drink, where mercy's waters never sink, for God's own hand shall lead us home. No more in darkness shall we roam." The last note hung in the air like a blessing. For a long moment, no one moved or spoke. Then Reverend Thomas stepped forward, his own eyes glistening. "The mission's purpose was to bring God's mercy to these mountains," he said quietly. "Today, through this hymn and this faithful woman, that mercy flows again." He turned to face the congregation. "I declare, before God and these witnesses, that Owen and Eliana Hale are the rightful stewards of the mission Spring and its lands, as provided by the charter." Wheeler stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Without a word, he strode down the aisle and out of the church. The heavy door closed behind him with a final thud. But no one else moved. Instead, people began coming forward to shake Owen's hand and embrace Eliana. Mrs. Gray hugged her tight, whispering, "Your mother would be so proud." Old Mr. Peterson clasped her hand in his gnarled ones, tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. Owen made his way to the front, moving through the crowd until he reached his wife. His eyes shone with a light Eliana had never seen before. Pride, yes, but something deeper too. Understanding. peace. You've brought healing to more than just the land, he said softly, taking her hand. Reverend Thomas raised his hands for silence. Let us pray together, giving thanks for God's mercy and the restoration of both property and hearts. As the congregation bowed their heads, sunlight broke through the church's frosted windows, casting rainbow patterns across the wooden floor. The light touched Eliana's face like a tender hand, warming her inside and out. She felt Owen's strong fingers intertwined with hers, anchoring her in this moment of grace. Where there had been shame, now stood dignity. Where there had been mockery, now rose respect. And where there had been a marriage of mere convenience, now bloomed something far more precious, a union blessed by both God and community, sealed with a song of mercy. The warmth of that blessing would carry them through many winters to come, as sure and steady as the spring that flowed beneath their mountain home. The late March sun warmed the mountainside, turning patches of snow into trickling streams. Owen stood on the half-finished roof of their cabin, hammer in hand, watching winter's grip loosen day by day. Below, Eliana knelt in the dark earth of their garden plot, her hands working the soil with gentle determination. "Mind those loose shingles up there," she called, shading her eyes against the bright sky. Owen smiled, still marveling at how naturally her concern for him flowed now. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, securing another nail with practiced strikes. The creek rushed louder these days, swollen with melting snow. Its song mingled with the tap of Owen's hammer and the soft humming that always seemed to accompany Eliana's work. She pressed tiny seeds into the earth, carrots, beans, and the precious tomato seeds Mrs. Gray had shared last week. Their cabin was transforming, bit by bit. Owen had added a proper window to catch the morning light, and Eliana had hung fresh curtains sewn from flour sacks. The roof would be sound before the spring rains came. Inside, she'd scrubbed every surface until the wood gleamed, and arranged wildflowers in tin cans along the windowsill. As the afternoon lengthened, wagon wheels creaked up the trail. The Petersons had come, bringing a load of split rails for the garden fence. Behind them rode the Cooper family, their children clutching slate boards for their evening lessons. "Brought you some sourdough starter," Mrs. Peterson called out, climbing down from her wagon. "And John here's right handy with fence work, if you could use the help." Owen climbed down from the roof, wiping his brow. "Much obliged," he said, meaning it deeply. These visits had become common now, neighbors dropping by with offerings of help or seeking quiet conversation on the porch. While the men set to work on the fence, Eliana gathered the Cooper children at the rough table they'd set up under the pines. 6-year-old Mary traced her letters carefully, while 8-year-old Thomas struggled with his sums. Eliana's patience never wavered as she guided their small hands. "Just like that," she encouraged. "See how the numbers tell their own kind of story?" As dusk approached, Owen lit the lamp and opened his wife's Bible, Sarah's Bible, though the pain of thinking her name had softened now. The leather cover was worn smooth from years of faithful hands. He cleared his throat and began reading from Psalms, his deep voice carrying across their evening meal of bread and stew. Eliana watched him over the lamplight, remembering how long it had taken him to open that Bible again. Now it was their nightly ritual, God's words filling their home like a gentle presence. The next afternoon, while checking the spring's flow, they found something remarkable. A new stream had broken through the rocky soil, clear water bubbling up like liquid light. "Look," Eliana breathed, kneeling beside it. The water ran swift and pure, carving its own path down the mountainside. Owen dipped his hand in the cold flow. "Sweet as heaven," he said softly. "And steady, too, not just meltwater." They stood together, watching this new blessing emerge from the earth. After a moment, Eliana spoke. "We should call it Mercy's Spring." Owen nodded, understanding perfectly. This was what mercy looked like. Fresh water from stone, life from dormant ground, hope flowing where there had been only grief. Later, as the sky turned purple with sunset, they sat together on their newly mended porch. The air was soft with spring promises, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Below them, their garden lay freshly planted, the new fence gleaming pale in the fading light. "Thank you," Owen said quietly, breaking their comfortable silence. Eliana looked at him questioningly. "For saving it all," he continued. "The land, yes, but—" He gestured to his chest, where his heart beat steady and whole again. "My soul, too." Eliana's laugh rang out, clear as the new spring's water. "I only sang the song he already wrote," she said, her eyes twinkling. "The mercy was here all along, waiting to flow again." Owen took her hand, feeling its strength and gentleness. Together they watched evening shadows creep across their mountain home, listening to the sound of water running free and clear in the gathering dark. Summer crept into the valley like a gentle tide, painting the mountainside with splashes of purple lupine and golden sunflowers. The warm June winds carried the scent of pine and wild sage through the restored cabin's open windows, where fresh curtains danced in the breeze. Inside, Eliana hummed while kneading bread dough, her strong hands working with practiced ease. The cabin had transformed since those first cold days of winter. Now colorful quilts brightened the walls, dried herbs hung from the rafters, and fresh-cut wildflowers graced the table in simple tin cans. Through the new window Owen had installed, morning light spilled across the swept wooden floor, catching dust motes that danced like tiny stars. Owen paused in the doorway, watching his wife work. The fear and uncertainty that had marked her face in those early days had melted away like spring snow. In its place bloomed a quiet confidence, a steady joy that showed itself in 100 small ways. The lift of her chin, the sure movements of her hands, the ready smile that came more and more easily these days. "Heading down to check the spring," he said, adjusting his hat. "Reckon I might find some company there?" Eliana laughed, a sound that still surprised him with its warmth. "Those children will be waiting already, I expect. Cannot keep them away from their singing lessons." She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped closer, touching his arm gently. The simple gesture spoke volumes about how far they had come. "I will join you once this bread is in the oven." Owen nodded, savoring the peaceful moment. The cabin that had once felt like a tomb of memories now hummed with life. Sarah's old Bible lay open on the table beside Eliana's worn hymnal, their pages mingling like old friends. Even the thought of his first wife brought more peace than pain these days, a gentle ache rather than a crushing weight. Outside, the morning air carried the sweet scent of summer grass. Owen walked the familiar path down to Mercy's Spring, where the sound of children's voices already floated up through the trees. The new stream they had discovered in early spring now ran strong and clear, carving its own channel down the mountainside. 6 young faces turned to greet him as he approached the spring. They sat in a half-circle on smooth rocks, slates and primers forgotten beside them as they waited for their singing lesson. Little Mary Cooper, all of 6 years old, waved excitedly. "Mr. Owen, will you sing with us today?" she called out, her gap-toothed smile bright as sunshine. He tipped his hat to her. "Reckon I might, if you all ask nice enough." The children giggled. They had learned not to fear his tall frame and quiet ways, had come to know the gentle heart that lay beneath his weathered exterior. Owen settled on a fallen log nearby, content to listen as they practiced their letters and numbers while waiting for Eliana. When she appeared through the trees a short while later, the children scrambled to their feet. "Teacher! Teacher!" they called out, crowding around her like eager chicks. Eliana's laugh rang across the meadow as she gathered them back into their circle. "Now then," she said, smoothing her skirt as she sat on her favorite rock. "Shall we begin with the Mountain Mercy Song?" Owen closed his eyes as their young voices rose in the familiar melody. The hymn that had once pierced his heart with grief now filled him with gratitude. Through the children's sweet singing, he could almost hear Sarah's voice joining in, blessing what Mercy had built from the ashes of loss. As morning turned to afternoon, more neighbors stopped by the spring. Some brought food to share, others came seeking prayer or conversation. The meadow had become a gathering place, a source of both physical and spiritual refreshment for the scattered mountain families. Martha Jensen, watching Eliana lead the children in another hymn, leaned close to Owen. "She surely is a blessing to this valley," she said softly. "The way you look at her, well, it reminds me of how my James used to call me his morning star." Owen smiled, his eyes never leaving Eliana. "I call her my song," he replied, voice rough with emotion. "Oh?" Martha's eyes crinkled with interest. "And why is that?" Owen thought for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Because she thawed the mountain that used to be my heart," he said finally. "Brought music back to places I thought would stay silent forever." Martha patted his arm, understanding in her eyes. They both watched as Eliana gathered the youngest children close, teaching them a simple prayer song. Her voice rose clear and strong, no longer bearing any trace of the timidity that had marked her first days in the valley. As afternoon faded toward evening, the neighbors began to head home. Owen and Eliana walked back to their cabin hand in hand, the lingering warmth of the day wrapping around them like a blessing. Fireflies began to dance in the growing shadows, their light matching the peace that glowed in both their hearts. Inside, they shared a quiet supper of fresh bread and sweet butter, garden vegetables, and the last of the winter's preserved venison. Lamplight cast warm shadows on the walls, turning their simple meal into something sacred. Neither felt the need to fill the silence with words. They had learned to read each other's hearts in the quiet moments. After the dishes were washed and dried, Owen built up the fire while Eliana sat in Sarah's old rocking chair, mending one of his shirts. The familiar creak of the rocker mingled with the pop and hiss of the fire, creating its own kind of music. "Do you ever regret it?" Eliana asked suddenly, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "That day at the auction block when you spoke up?" Owen turned from the fire to look at her, his face softened by flickering shadows. "Only regret is that I almost let fear keep me from doing what was right," he said quietly. "God knew what he was about that day, though I surely did not." Eliana's smile was tender. "He was writing a new song for both of us, wasn't he? One neither of us could have imagined." "That he was," Owen agreed, moving to stand behind her chair. He placed his hands on her shoulders, feeling the solid reality of her presence. "And he gave me the best singing partner a man could ask for." Her laugh filled the cabin like sunshine. Outside, a whippoorwill called into the gathering night, its song carrying across the valley. The sound reminded Owen of those first dark days when he had lived alone with his grief, before Mercy had found him in the shape of a young woman's courage and faith. As the evening deepened, they moved about the cabin in the well-practiced dance of their nightly routine. Owen checked the doors, while Eliana banked the fire. The lamp's warm glow spilled out through the windows, a beacon of hope in the darkness. Together they stood in the doorway, looking out at the star-filled sky. The night air carried the echo of the mountain mercy song, as if the hills themselves remembered and sang along. Perhaps they did. These ancient mountains had seen countless stories of loss and redemption, had witnessed mercy's power to heal what seemed beyond mending. Owen drew Eliana close, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his side. They were not joined by conventional beauty or luck, but by something far stronger, the fierce and tender grace that had turned strangers into beloved companions, had transformed a marriage of necessity into a living testimony of God's faithfulness. As they closed the cabin door, the lamplight glowed warm against the night. Inside, two souls redeemed by mercy prepared for sleep, their love a quiet hymn that would continue to sing through all their days to come. Through the valley, carried on the gentle summer wind, the distant echo of the mountain mercy song drifted over the hills, a reminder that even the hardest hearts could learn to sing again, if only they opened themselves to love's transforming power. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.